The Gospel of John obviously begins with this reference back to Genesis 1. Now, if you remember, we've already seen a text that goes back to Genesis 1, the Gospel of Thomas. But if you notice, John steps back one more step, where in the Gospel of Thomas you have Jesus talked about with the light, and that the light that permeates all things, split a rock and I am there. This inner reality, divine reality, that from the divine emanation, that creation then kind of obscures, or at least materiality obscures. In John, you have this move back to Genesis 1:1, to the very Word of God that creates through God speaking in Genesis 1:3. So in that way, John actually takes and has this means of pushing back to get the divine Word. In the beginning was the Word. In the arche was the Word. Do not think chronologically. Think in the first principle was the Word. Then the Word was with God, because when God speaks, you understand in Genesis 1:3 that the Word is distinct from God. At the same time, the Word was God. That you have the Word in between God and creation does not mediate between the two, as you kind of have implied in the Gospel of Thomas, in an emanation, but you have this distinction between creation and creator, and the divine Word is there. So what you have at the very beginning of John is an interpretation of Genesis 1:1 that ties the Word to the Creator as the means of creation, differentiated from the beginning, from the arche, from the fundamental principle, even as within that fundamental principle, and identical to that fundamental principle, particularly when shifted and compared to the creation through whom all things are created. So John begins at that point, and then he moves to that in him was the light. That you move on to the light because the light is in the Word, even as the Word creates the light. By doing this, it takes what Thomas is saying, but shifts it into a framework where God creates from nothing. That the light is not the Word per se, but the Word, because the light is created by the Word, remains in the light. So in him was light, and the light was the life. And so you have this third derivation, that the divine creation, the divine life itself, becomes embedded in the creation through the Word, which is both distinct from the creation, because remember, the Word was with God and the Word was God. But at the same time, the whole principle of life is not found in the creation itself, but in the divine Word through whom the God creates as God, that makes creation what it is. So, and leaves that implant of itself within it. So you see, it's a much more radical view than what you have in the Gospel of Thomas, even as it supplants it. Creation is not an emanation from a divine light that spins off in a kind of a fall from the divine. Creation is the free gifting of the world, materiality, from the Word, through which God's rationality is seen and implanted, even as that life comes through him, but is profoundly, distinctly from him. So the Gospel of John begins with this very important equation of the Word with God, the ones by which God mediates creation, even creates, so that all things were created in and through him, even as it has a more radical distinction from him in its very articulation of its relationship to the divine. John is, I think, taking on the Thomist Christians and beginning to build a way that is not something divine light that one participates in, but the divine Word through whom all things are created.